At this time, we'll begin with our opening statements. Mr. Guy, you may proceed.
May it please the court, counsel. Good morning. Fucking punks. These assholes, they always get away. Those were the words in that grown man's mouth as he followed in the dark a 17-year-old boy who he didn't know. And excuse my language, but those were his words, not mine. Fucking punks. These assholes, they always get away. Those were the words in that man's chest when he got out of his car, armed with a fully loaded semi-automatic pistol and 2 flashlights, to follow on foot Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was walking home from a 7-Eleven, armed with 23 ounces of Arizona brand fruit juice and a small bag of Skittles candies. Fucking punks. These assholes, they always get away. Those were the words in that defendant's head just moments before he pressed that pistol into Trayvon Martin's chest and pulled the trigger. And then, as the smoke and the smell of that fatal gunshot rose into a rainy Sunday Sanford night, Trayvon Martin, 21 days removed from his 16th year, was face down in wet grass, laboring through his final breaths on this earth. And that defendant, at that same time, was upright, walking around, preparing to tell law enforcement why it was he had just profiled, followed, and murdered an unarmed teenager. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth about the murder of Trayvon Martin is going to come directly from his mouth. From those hate-filled words that he used to describe a perfect stranger, and from the lies that he told to the police to try to justify his actions. If you'll indulge me for the next few minutes, I would like to share with you in a little greater detail the end of Trayvon Martin's young life and the overwhelming evidence of this defendant's guilt. The murder of Trayvon Martin was the product of 2 worlds colliding. In one world, a 17-year-old boy from Miami, Florida, a visitor to this town, who had gone to the store to get something to drink for himself and some candy for a 12-year-old friend. But in the other world, a 28-year-old grown man, somebody who wanted to be a police officer, somebody who had called the police numerous times about crime in his neighborhood, someone who had become the neighborhood watch captain, and someone who believed, most importantly, that it was his right to rid his neighborhood of anyone that he believed didn't belong. The date was February 26th of last year. Trayvon Martin was in town with his father, Tracy Martin, and they were visiting Tracy Martin's girlfriend, Brandy Green, and her 12-year-old son, Chad Joseph. They lived together in a townhome in a gated complex known as the Retreat at Twin Lakes. And on that day, Trayvon Martin spent the day with 12-year-old Chad Joseph doing what kids do. They watch TV. They play video games. They just hung out. But in the afternoon hours, in the early evening, Trayvon Martin decided to go to the store to get something to drink. And he asked Chad Joseph, "Do you want anything?" "Skittles," was the reply. And so Trayvon Martin set out on foot by himself and walked just less than a mile to a nearby 7-Eleven. You'll see his purchase of those 2 items, 23-ounce can of Arizona brand fruit juice and Skittles, on a 7-Eleven surveillance video. And at 6:24 p.m., he walked out the door. And he started walking home in the rain. And although he was by himself, he wasn't entirely alone, because he spent that walk home on the phone with a young friend from Miami, Rachel Gentile. And as teenagers are wont to do, he talked to that girl the entire way home. But at that same time, when he got into the neighborhood of the retreat at Twin Lakes, there was this defendant riding around in his car, not with candy, not with fruit juice, but with a Kel-Tec 9mm semi-automatic pistol in a ready-to-fire position, meaning there was one live round in the chamber. And that firearm was tucked inside his waistband. And although that defendant was alone, he too was not by himself, because he picked up the phone and he called the Sanford Police Department. Because when he saw Trayvon Martin, he didn't see a young man walking home. As he told the dispatcher, Sean Nofke, he saw someone that was real suspicious. Somebody that looked like they were up to no good. Again, his words, and you'll hear that tape. It was recorded forever. And you'll hear how he describes Trayvon Martin and how he follows him. And how he says, not in response to a question, these assholes, they always get away. And he tells Sean Nofke, there's been a bunch of recent burglaries in my neighborhood. And you'll hear the door chime in his car when he gets out with his gun, and not one, but 2 flashlights to follow Trayvon Martin. And then, almost under his breath, that defendant will reveal to you his feelings about Trayvon Martin when he refers to him as a fucking punk. This 17-year-old boy walking home. And then right at the end of that phone call, this defendant makes the decision that brings all of us here today. Sean Nofke asked the defendant, shall I have the officer who's on his way meet you at the mailboxes? Because the defendant and he had discussed a kiosk of mailboxes that are in that neighborhood. And at first the defendant says yes. And then he changes his mind. Tell the officer to just call me and I'll tell him where I am. Because George Zimmerman was not going back to the mailboxes. And he wasn't going back to his car. He was going after Trayvon Martin. Less than 4 minutes after that defendant hung up with Sean Nofke, Rachel Gentile, that girl in Miami, heard Trayvon Martin say, what are you following me for? And then Trayvon Martin's phone went dead. And Trayvon Martin went dead. The first 2 officers to Trayvon Martin's body found him exactly like that defendant left him. Face down, his hands clutching his chest. He was dressed in white tennis shoes, long khaki pants, a dark gray hooded sweatshirt. He had a plastic dark gray watch on his left wrist. The little earbuds that he was using to talk to Rachel Gentile on the phone were right next to his head. And his phone was right next to his body. And Sergeant Raimondo will explain to you the steps that he took to save Trayvon Martin's life. And he'll admit to you, he didn't exactly follow SOPs. with the police department, because they hold that if you are to try to give mouth-to-mouth to somebody, that you go to your car first and you get a breathing mask to separate your mouth from their mouth. Well, Sergeant Raimondo realized there was no time for that. So he put his lips on Trayvon Martin's lips and tried to breathe life into him. And Officer Ayala put his palms on Trayvon Martin's chest and tried to push life into him. But it was too late. Trayvon Martin had already passed. Rescue responded soon after, and they took over the CPR efforts, and they hooked up a cardiac monitor to Trayvon Martin. It was a flat line. He had already died. And so Sergeant Raimondo then went to his car, and he got a yellow medical blanket, and he put it over Trayvon Martin's body. And they took the drink can that he had in the center pocket of his sweatshirt, and they put that on top of the blanket. You also hear from the first officer that had contact with this defendant. He was walking around, able to walk, talk, balance, answer questions, understand questions. He had a bloody, swollen nose, and he had 2 lacerations on the back of his head. And you'll hear from the rescue personnel that treated the defendant at the scene. They wiped the blood from his nose, and they wiped the blood from the back of his head. And then the defendant was asked, "Do you want to go to the hospital?" "No," was the defendant's response. And so they took him downtown. And you'll see exactly how he appeared, because when he got downtown to the police station, they took over 30 photographs of him, head to toe, front and back. You'll see exactly how he looked that night. Exactly. And you'll see videos of him walking through the police station, getting out of the car. And then he goes to that interview room where all of his statements would be recorded for you. That night, the next day, even a walkthrough the next day where they literally got a video camera and let him explain in his own words what had happened. And he did. And you will learn that that's when he began to spin that tangled web of lies. For example, he told the police that it was just after he hung up with Sean Nofke, the non-emergency dispatcher, that Trayvon Martin approached him, confronted him, said a couple of words to him, and then punched him and knocked him to the ground. Just moments after that. Ladies and gentlemen, that did not happen. You will have phone records. Phone records from his call and phone records from Trayvon Martin's call. The defendant hung up the phone with Sean Nofke at 7:13 p.m. and 43 seconds. But Trayvon Martin, who was on the phone with that girl from Miami, his call didn't end until 7:15 and 44 seconds. 2 minutes later. 2 minutes that defendant was not going back to his car. He wasn't walking towards the mailboxes. He was walking after Trayvon Martin. For example, the defendant told the police that at one point while he was sitting in his car following Trayvon Martin ran behind some townhomes and then came back out, circled his car, and then ran back again. Listen to the non-emergency call that happened in real time, and you'll see that that didn't happen. It's physically impossible the way he described it. For example, he told the police that the reason he got out of the car was because Sean Nofke told him, "We need an address." That didn't happen. Listen to his non-emergency call. Sean Nofke never said that. For example, he said that Trayvon Martin had him down on the ground, was straddled over top of him, and took his hands and covered his mouth and his nose. His nose that was bleeding already from having been struck by the first punch. Well, they looked at Trayvon Martin's hands. There was no blood on them. They took wooden sticks and they scraped his fingernails. Trayvon Martin's. No blood of George Zimmerman. No DNA of George Zimmerman. They examined the cuffs of his sweatshirts. He had two on, two long sleeve sweatshirts. They examined the cuffs and the sleeves. No blood of George Zimmerman. No DNA of that defendant. The only blood of George Zimmerman was on the waistband of one of Trayvon Martin's shirts. But the defendant's, Trayvon Martin's blood was on the defendant's clothes. For example, the defendant claims that while Trayvon Martin was on top of him, Trayvon Martin said to him, "You're going to die tonight." Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear from people who were out there. Nobody heard that. For example, he said that after he shot Trayvon Martin, he got on top of Trayvon Martin on his back, and he took his arms and he spread them out. That didn't happen. You're going to see the pictures of Trayvon Martin by a civilian who went out there that night before the police got there and snapped off a photo on his phone. Trayvon Martin's hands are underneath his chest. Listen carefully to his statements. And you won't just have his statements and those phone records. You'll have physical evidence. Irrefutable physical evidence. Like the DNA evidence of Anthony Gorgone with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. He was the one who examined the sweatshirts and didn't find any of the defendant's blood on Trayvon Martin's cuffs or sleeves. And he was the one who examined those little wooden sticks and didn't find any of the defendant's blood or DNA on those either. He also examined swabs taken from the defendant's gun and that holster that he had inside his waistband, because the defendant claimed that Trayvon Martin saw his gun and went for his gun, so they tested it. Well, guess what? Trayvon Martin's DNA is not on that gun. Trayvon Martin's DNA is not on that holster. And you'll hear from a firearms expert also with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Amy Seward, who will tell and show you all about that firearm. Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. Holds 7 rounds in the magazine that loads from the bottom. But she'll tell you at the time it was fired, there were 8 rounds in the gun because there was a live round already in the chamber. So it wasn't necessary for the defendant to rack it to load a round. It was ready to go. And you'll learn that although this firearm doesn't have an external safety mechanism, it has what they call an extra long trigger travel distance, which is just what it sounds like. Person has to depress the trigger a longer distance to ensure that there are no accidental discharges. And Amy Seward did distance testing to determine the distance between the muzzle of the gun, that is the end of the barrel, and Trayvon Martin's clothing when he was shot. The distance was 0. It was a contact shot. He pressed that gun into Trayvon Martin's chest, and you will see with your own eyes the burn marks on each of his sweatshirts where that hot lead passed through. You'll also have the evidence from the scene. And the first thing you'll learn about that scene is how remarkably dark it was. Trayvon Martin was murdered in the back of 2 sets of townhomes. There's no street lighting back there. There's no pole lights. There were 1 or 2 porch lights on, but you'll see how very dim they are and how remarkably dark it was, and that it was raining. And they will give you, Diana Smith, the crime scene technician, will give you all of the physical evidence there. Trayvon Martin's cell phone, the headphones, the defendant's big black flashlight that was right by Trayvon Martin's body, his little flashlight on a keychain that was some 30 feet away, a bag that Sergeant Raimondo used, because when they started doing CPR, Sergeant Raimondo heard air seeping from Trayvon Martin's chest. And he called for someone to bring him some kind of plastic, and they brought him a white Walmart bag. And they held that on his chest to keep the air in while they were doing CPR. You'll have the drink can, the Skittles from the pocket of his sweatshirt, the shell casing that was right near his body was also collected. And you won't just have the physical evidence at the scene, you'll have the testimony of people who were there, residents. And they too will tell you how dark it was out there. And the other thing that they will share with you is that no one heard or saw this from beginning to end. All of them who were witnesses got slices, if you will, of what happened. Some at the beginning, some in the middle, and some at the end, just like you would expect with real life on a rainy Sunday night. But you'll learn that those witnesses too contradict the defendant's story about what happened, because he described a very short verbal exchange between the two of them. But the witnesses will tell you they heard a longer verbal exchange that went on for some time. And the defendant said he was knocked down by the first punch and Trayvon Martin got on top of him. But I expect you'll hear from a witness who says she saw them upright, struggling. And you'll learn that Trayvon Martin's body, again, is some 30 feet away from where the defendant claims he was first knocked down. And nobody heard Trayvon Martin say anything about the defendant, that he was going to die tonight. You will hear from a witness who came outside of his residence during the middle of it. And he will tell you that he thought at first it was some people, kids playing, but then when he got outside he realized it was something more serious. And he told him to stop. And he saw one person, who was Trayvon Martin, on top of this defendant. He was looking at Trayvon Martin's back. And he'll tell you that he saw his hands on the defendant's body. But he didn't see arms flailing. He didn't hear flesh meeting flesh. He didn't see or hear the defendant's head being slammed into concrete like the defendant claimed. He didn't hear or see any of that. And then he too saw his small part and went inside. Ladies and gentlemen, You're also going to hear from a physician's assistant named Lindsay Fulgate, who examined this defendant the very next morning at 11:15 a.m. when he walked into her office. For this reason, he told her he needed a note for work so he could go back to work. He didn't complain of so much as a headache, no dizziness, no vomiting, no nausea. He said he needed a note for work, but she examined him. And she examined his nose and thought that it possibly could be broken. But then she looked at it with her instruments, and everything was perfectly in line. He didn't have so much as a deviated septum. And she looked at the injuries on the back of his head. She measured them. The longest one was 2 centimeters. That's about 3/4 of an inch. Neither of the 2 lacerations needed a single suture. Also in this case, in addition to the witnesses, you will have a bone-chilling 911 call, where in the background you will hear the gunshot that killed Trayvon Martin, and you will hear screaming in the background. Listen carefully, please, to that call, and listen carefully when the screaming stops. It's right when the gunshot goes off. Trayvon Martin was silenced immediately when the bullet that the defendant fired passed through his heart. And when that gunshot rings out on that 911 call, the screaming stops immediately. Listen carefully to that. Ladies and gentlemen, also in this case, you will learn about the person riding around in the car that night with the gun. That this defendant wanted to be a police officer, had applied to go on a police ride-along, was a criminal justice major, took classes in the law of self-defense and crimes in the state of Florida, studied them. You'll learn that he became a neighborhood watch coordinator because he reached out, the defendant, to the Sanford Police Department and a woman named Wendy Dorval and asked her to come to his community, and she did. And she gave a presentation about the do's and don'ts of neighborhood watch, and it's just like it sounds. See and report. Observe and call. He was told, do not be the vigilante police. Don't follow. Don't confront. Just call and observe. And you'll see the actual materials that he was provided. And you'll learn that he was appointed the neighborhood watch coordinator because of all the crimes in his neighborhood. Which is why when he first saw Trayvon Martin, he didn't see a kid from Miami walking home from the 7-Eleven. He profiled him as someone who was about to commit a crime in his neighborhood. And then he acted on it. And that's why we're here. And you'll learn about him physically. He wasn't nearly as large as he is now. He was just over 200 pounds. He stands 5'7.5". But at that time, back in February of 2012, he had been taking classes from a gym for a year and a half. Not any gym. Not Bailey's. But a gym where they teach you to fight. Kickboxing. Mixed martial arts. Self-defense. For a year and a half. That's what he was doing before February 26th of last year. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear from the medical examiner, Dr. Shipping Bow. You'll learn that Trayvon Martin arrived for his appointment with Dr. Bow, dressed in the same clothes that he was wearing when he walked out of the 7-Eleven. And in a sky blue, heavy plastic body bag that had a little lock on it, fastening together the two zippers. And the first thing you'll learn when you see Trayvon Martin's body stretched out on the medical examiner's table is how thin he was. He was 5'11", 158 pounds. 158 pounds. How remarkably thin he was. And they examined Trayvon Martin's body. In his hands, he didn't have bruised knuckles. He didn't have swollen hands. The only injury to his hand that was capable of being photographed was a small abrasion on his left ring finger. Trayvon Martin was right-handed. That was the only injuries to his hands. And Dr. Bow will take you through the fatal gunshot. And just like the shirts, you'll see burn marks on Trayvon Martin's chest. Just to the left of center, you'll see the little stipples, they call them, stippling, little pinpricks in his skin where the bullet entered. And Dr. Bow will take you through the path of that bullet. It wasn't to the left, it wasn't to the right, it wasn't up, it wasn't down. Straight through his body, right through his heart, right where the defendant put it. And ladies and gentlemen, that is just some of the evidence in this case. And at the end of this trial, Judge Nelson will read to you the law that applies to all of us, and a law that applies to each of us. And we are confident that at the end of this trial, you will know in your head, in your heart, in your stomach, that George Zimmerman did not shoot Trayvon Martin because he had to. He shot him for the worst of all reasons, because he wanted to. Thank you for your time.